Moving to the small town of Brookville represented a new beginning for the Johnson family. David, Sarah, and their two children, Emily and Michael, were looking for tranquility after years of life in the big city. They found the perfect house, a beautiful two-story Victorian residence with a large garden and stunning views of the surrounding mountains. There was just one strange detail. The house next door had been abandoned for decades. Locals whispered stories about the abandoned house, spreading superstitions like small-town gossip. It was said that strange things happened there at night and that the property was cursed. The windows were covered in cobwebs and the walls were peeling, but for the Johnson family, that was a plus. They were determined to have as much privacy as possible. However, as the days turned into weeks, strange events began to unfold. Sometimes at night, the family would hear sounds like whispering footsteps coming from the abandoned house next door. Windows creaked and doors slammed, even when there was no wind. At first, the Johnsons ignored these incidents, attributing them to the wind or normal creaking noises in an old house. After all, they didn't believe in superstitions and weren't willing to be carried away by ghost stories. But gradually the feeling of being watched became undeniable. One night, while the family was gathered in the living room watching a movie, Emily, the youngest daughter, noticed something out of the corner of her eye. She saw a figure moving upstairs in the abandoned house, a wrinkled and hunched figure watching them through the dark window. Emily let out a surprised scream and pointed to the window. "Look! Someone's next door." Everyone turned, but the figure had disappeared. David, the father, sighed and tried to calm his daughter. "It must just be our imagination, Emily. Maybe it's a resident of another house or a visitor." Sarah, the mother, was less convinced. She looked up at the window of the abandoned house and felt a chill run down her spine. "It's strange, but maybe someone entered the house by mistake. I'll call the police to check." While Sarah called the police, Emily continued to watch the house next door, certain she hadn't imagined the crumpled figure. The police arrived quickly, but upon checking the abandoned house, they found no one inside. "It must have been a resident wandering around the house," the officer suggested as he left. "There's nothing to worry about." The Johnsons agreed with the officer's explanation and tried to return to their normal routine. However, the image of the old man in the window haunted Emily, who continued to have the feeling that they were being watched. That night, they slept with all the lights on and the curtains closed, trying to convince themselves that everything was fine. But they still didn't know that the strange events were just beginning, and that a mysterious shadow was about to become an increasingly frightening presence in their lives. The Johnsons tried to resume their normal lives after the scary night Emily spotted the old man next door. They continued to believe that the wrinkled figure was just a resident wandering around the abandoned house. However, disturbing events began to occur more frequently, forcing them to reconsider their beliefs. Sometimes during the night, the family would hear strange sounds coming from the house next door. Footsteps shuffled, as if someone was moving slowly through the empty rooms. Windows creaked and doors slammed, even when there was no wind. The lights in the abandoned house turned on and off inexplicably, creating unsettling shadows in the darkness. Emily was particularly distraught. She continued to feel the old man's presence watching them, even when there was no visible evidence of his presence. She had frequent nightmares and was increasingly anxious. One afternoon, when the Johnsons were in their backyard, enjoying a rare moment of peace, they saw something that made them freeze. The door of the abandoned house opened slowly, as if someone was leaving, but there was no one in sight. Sarah was the first to recover her voice. "You guys saw that, right?" David and Emily nodded, their eyes fixed on the open door of the house next door. They decided to investigate. With renewed courage, they approached the house and entered slowly, wary of what they might find. The abandoned house was dark and dusty, with furniture covered in old sheets. They walked down the hall and up the stairs to the bedroom where they had seen the door open. To his surprise, the room was empty and silent. Emily looked at the window and then at the door. "This is where I saw him. I'm sure of it." David and Sarah exchanged worried glances, but found no explanation for what they were witnessing. It looked like the house. Abandoned, had secrets they could not understand. That night, as the family gathered in the living room, the light in the house next door came on again. They watched with wide eyes as the old man's shadow passed from one window to another, as if he were patrolling the house. There was no way to ignore the evidence before them. They decided it was time to confront their mysterious neighbor. David and Sarah left the house and knocked on the door of the abandoned house. However, they received no response. The door was locked and no one answered. Sarah called the police once again, explaining the situation. The police arrived promptly, but after a thorough search of the house, they found no signs of a break-in or anyone inside. They were perplexed, but they could do nothing more. As the disturbing events continued, the Johnsons felt they were becoming increasingly isolated. Neighbors avoided talking about the house next door, and ghost stories multiplied. The family began to consider the possibility of moving again, leaving the house and the mystery that surrounded it behind. But the worst was yet to come, as they would soon discover that the lonely old man had an unhealthy obsession that would put them in ever greater danger. As the disturbing events continued to unfold, it became obvious that the old man in the abandoned house had an unhealthy obsession with the Johnson family. He persisted in watching them, as if he was captivated by every move they made. Tension in the family grew, and the feeling of being prisoners in their own home was overwhelming. One night, when David was away on work, the old man dared to go further in his obsession. He snuck into the Johnsons' house, like a silent shadow, and began rummaging through their belongings. His wife, Sarah, was downstairs watching television when she heard a noise coming from above. She walked up the stairs, her heart pounding, and entered Emily's room. What she saw made her let out a scream of terror. The old man was there, standing in the middle of the room, his eyes empty and devoid of humanity, staring at her. Sarah was paralyzed with fear as the old man continued to stare at her, as if he was examining her soul. The room was frozen silent, except for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing and the intruder's expressionless gaze. Finally, Sarah managed to muster up enough courage to scream, and in doing so, she woke up the family. Emily, Michael, and even the family dog began barking frantically. The barking echoed through the house and reached neighbors, who called the police when they heard the commotion. When police arrived on the scene, they found the old man still in the Johnsons' house. He offered no resistance when arrested and seemed completely oblivious to the severity of his intrusion. Sarah, shaking with fear, told the police what had happened and how the old man had sneaked into her house. The police took the old man into custody, but he offered no explanation for his actions. His eyes remained blank, as if he were in a trance. The Johnson family was taken to the police station to give statements, and it became clear that the old man was not just a lonely stranger, but someone who had a disturbing connection to the house next door. The questions that hung in the air were, who was he? Why was he so obsessed with the Johnson family? And what did he want? As the investigation continued, the abandoned house next door seemed more ominous than ever. Sarah and David began to fear for their children's safety and wonder if moving to Brookville had been a terrible mistake. No one in town seemed to know the truth about the old man, and everyone avoided mentioning the house next door. For the Johnsons, it was clear that they were alone in the struggle to uncover the truth behind the dark mystery surrounding the old man and the abandoned house. As the investigation into the old man progressed, the Johnsons tried to get their lives back on track, but the fear and paranoia remained. The sleepless nights and unanswered questions about why the old man was so obsessed with them continued to haunt them. During interrogations, the old man revealed little about himself. He looked confused, and his mind wandered through disjointed thoughts. However, little by little, a story began to emerge. He used to own the house next door decades ago before losing it due to overwhelming financial debt. The old man, whose name was Harold, described how his life had fallen apart after the loss of his home. He isolated himself from the world, living in the shadows of the abandoned house, nurturing a growing bitterness and an obsession with regaining what he considered his right. As Harold shared his dark memories, it became clear that he believed the Johnson family had trespassed on his property. He saw David, Sarah, Emily, and Michael like intruders, as if they had stolen the life he once knew. The old man was trapped in a state of mental imbalance, unable to distinguish between the past and the present. His obsession led him to watch the Johnson family and believe he could regain the home, life, and family he had lost. As Harold's story unfolded, The Johnsons realized they were facing not just a lonely stranger, but someone deeply troubled. They began to feel a mixture of compassion and fear for the old man, whose life had been consumed by his obsession. Harold was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where he would receive the necessary treatment for his mental condition. The Johnson family finally found some relief, but the trauma remained. The abandoned house next door remained a grim reminder of their terrifying experience. They learned that sometimes terror can be closer than we imagine, and that abandoned houses hold secrets that can manifest themselves in frightening ways. The Johnson family faced the nightmare, and although they found answers to their questions, the scar left by their experience remained. However, the episode also made them stronger as a family. They learned to value safety and support for each other and found the strength to move forward, knowing they were more united than ever. The house next door, with its dark past and disturbed elderly resident, became a frightening chapter in their lives, but also a lesson in the power of resilience and family love.